Welcome to Palantir Night Live. This is our third session, as many of you guys actually already know. My name is Trey Stevens. I'm the MC, I guess, of Palantir Night Live. So I just want to walk you guys through a couple things. Then we're going to introduce Secretary Chertoff, and then I'll drop the stage, and it'll be all his. So, click. Okay. Did I go backwards? I think I went backwards. There we go. Yeah, boo, that was pretty bad. All right, so obviously, Secretary Chertoff is our speaker tonight. The schedule for how we're going to do this, as you know, the first 30 minutes is meet and greet, which are done, so there's no reason for me to talk about. The presentation will go from right about 7 to right about 7:30, and then we'll have 30 minutes of Q&A. So it's open floor. That's usually the pretty entertaining time. And then 8 o'clock to 8:30, we're going to break again for socialize. The game room will be open as well, so if you guys want to drop back and play some classic Nintendo or play Call of Duty, it's really up to you. So, I know a lot of you brought your computers, so we've got bloggers, we've got tweeters, all kinds of people here. So if you want to log in on your iPhone, your Droid phone, or your computer, our wireless network is P&L guest, and there's no password, so you should just be able to log right in. Some of you are also following us on Facebook. It's facebook.com/Palantir. You can also follow us on Twitter. Our username is @PalantirTech, and the hashtag is #PNLDC. I know that some of you have been using Palantir Night Live, and others of you have been using #PNL. Don't use PNL. Because it's actually like some Portuguese neurolinguistics something, so you're going to get mixed in with a bunch of non-English posts. So PNLDC is what we're going to go with. This is a quick map of our office here, which we call Rivendell. So if you hear any of us calling it that, that's what it is. Our headquarters is the Shire. Our office here is Rivendell. So after the talk, you can get your hands on with Palantir if you want, in the training room, which is on your way out of the building. So, or out of this office suite. So go ahead and give it a check out. We'll have some people staffing over there to show you what it is that we actually do. Our next event is July the 13th with Vint Cerf, who most of you guys have probably heard of. He's the father of the internet. So it should be a really, really cool talk. I encourage you all to wear three-piece suits just because he does, and that's awesome. So very quickly, just to introduce Secretary Chertoff before he comes up. He's a former Secretary of Homeland Security under President Bush. He's also the co-founder and managing principal currently of the Chertoff Group, and I'll let him kind of take it from there. So if you join me in welcoming Secretary Chertoff. We're going to drop the screen and
All right. I don't need the lecture, and I can just do it. If this was really like Saturday Night Live, I'd sing or tell comedy, have a comedy routine. Well, thank you for having me. I like the layout of this office space, where it's centered around the kitchen and the game room. And Chitra took me around to give me a little bit of a tour, and I kept looking for the workspace, but it was hard to find. So that's a good orientation, is between work and play. I'm delighted to be here. I've had a little bit of an introduction to what the company does, and I think it's very exciting and very much on the cutting edge of some really interesting stuff. I thought what I would talk about is what I see as the kind of current threat picture. What is the world in which we live, both in terms of physical threat and cyber threat, because we really are at an inflection point in the way we look at security in the world. It's very much different now than we thought it was prior to September 11th, 2001. In many ways, it's the difference between a 20th century world and a 21st century world, with some very interesting challenges and very interesting opportunities. But before I talk about that, and I promised Chitra I would sprinkle in liberally personal anecdotes and experiences and war stories, I should tell you a little bit about what I'm doing. I'm the chairman and managing principal of a firm called the Chertoff Group. We do security consulting, which basically breaks down into three areas: investment advice for companies and investment firms that want to invest in security, homeland security, defense, or intelligence; business advice for businesses in the space that want to understand how they can better their position and what the future of their business holds and what the opportunities and the pitfalls are. And then what I would call consumer consulting in the area of security, dealing with end users, whether they're governments or private companies that are concerned about their own physical or cybersecurity. And it's a very, very fast-changing world. It gives me a real opportunity to interact with a wide variety of companies and people who are doing work in the security field, very broadly defined, where there's a lot of very exciting cutting-edge work. And what always impresses me is the speed with which people adapt to the emerging challenges and are able to reconfigure the technology and the thought process. And frankly, it's usually the strategic architecture which lags behind. It's the thinking about what the system ought to be like that is the last thing that falls into place, and that's frankly usually the drag on the system. So how did I get involved in this business? Well, you know, I started out as a lawyer, was a criminal prosecutor, tried a lot of criminal cases, including a big organized crime case called the Commission case, which was a 1986 prosecution of the board of directors of La Cosa Nostra, the mafia, which were basically the bosses of the 4 principal New York mafia families. And they were involved in a literally tens of $million extortion scheme in which they dominated the entire construction industry of New York. They dominated the waste carting industry. They did gambling, loan sharking, any kind of criminal activity they were deeply involved in. And that prosecution, which lasted for about 10 weeks and resulted in everybody getting convicted and getting about 100 years in prison, more or less, was pretty much what I thought I'd be doing for the rest of my life. I thought I'd be a lawyer and eventually perhaps be a judge. In June of 2001, I was confirmed to be the head of the criminal division at the Department of Justice when President George W. Bush came in. And right before I arrived, I kind of put down on a piece of paper the things that I thought would be the major issues I would be dealing with as head of the criminal division. So I put down money laundering, I put down political corruption, I put down business fraud, and then I also put down terrorism, because we had had the bombing of the USS Cole the prior December. We'd had the East Africa, India bombings. We had the Khobar Tower bombing in Saudi Arabia in 1996. So I had some sense that this might be an issue that I'd be dealing with from time to time. And then, as you will recall, on September 11th, there was a huge change in both my life and the life of pretty much everybody else in the United States. And to put it in context, I'll tell you what my experience was on that day. I was coming in slightly later than usual because I had a personal errand I had to do, and it was shortly before 9 o'clock. I was driving into Washington on Independence Avenue, and I called my office just to see what was going on, and my secretary said to me, a plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. And probably like most of you, I thought some nitwit private pilot got lost and put himself into the World Trade Center. So I said, well, transfer me over to one of my deputies who was watching it on television, and I got on the phone with him, and I said, what's going on? And he started to tell me, and then he said, a second plane crashed into the World Trade Center. And then I realized, and he realized, this was not an accident. So I got into the office in the next 5 minutes, and my deputy and I walked across Pennsylvania Avenue to the FBI's SIOC, Strategic Information Operations Center, which is the nerve center. It was basically the command center for operating domestic incidents at that period of time. And I remember coming in, and by the time I arrived, we had had the attack on the Pentagon. And so there was a real awareness that we were dealing with something far beyond anything we had ever seen, certainly in the lives of anybody in the room, and probably in American history. And the thing that most struck me, and it's kind of the theme of my talk, is the lack of information. Because really the issue of how to deal with this, both to prevent it and to respond, is a question of information. And the feeling you get when you realize that you have people who are carrying out an attack inside the United States, launched inside the United States, not from air bases overseas, and and you have no idea how many more attacks are coming, that is an indescribable feeling, which I think strikes at the very core of what you feel as an American and certainly as a government official who has anything to do with protecting and securing the United States. And I think everything that has occurred in terms of security since then is really traceable to that day and that experience. And I would venture to say that everybody in the government who lived through that day in a government position of responsibility, that was a game changer. And there was also a bond formed among the people who served on that day that I think is unlike the bond that is usually formed outside of perhaps the military serving in combat. What we quickly learned when we got information about who was on the plane was that this was in fact an attack launched by likely launched by Al-Qaeda as a terrorist group. And the way we got the information was because heroic people got on their cell phones and began to call in information or just reactions to their loved ones on the ground. And it was the responsibility of the Bureau and the Department of Justice to collect that information to try to figure out who the hijackers were, where they had been sitting, so we could compare the manifests with the descriptions and try to get the identities of some of the hijackers and then begin the process of assembling a link chart to connect them up with other potential conspirators. And I had the particularly memorable and challenging task of calling a very good friend whose wife was on the plane that landed in the Pentagon. We had dinner with them and a group of other people the previous Saturday. And I had to say to him, I feel terrible about intruding in this horrible moment of sorrow, but I've got to ask you, will you meet with agents of the FBI and tell them what you heard on the telephone? Because we needed to know what that was. And that in many ways sums up what the challenge of the 21st century is, which is information. How do you get it? How do you make use of it? And how do you operationalize it? In the 20th century, when the threat we worried about was missiles or bombers launched from the Soviet Union, we had radar. And that was our early warning, and we knew that we would be able to detect an attack and react accordingly as soon as we had the warning. Radar is not useful in dealing with terrorists. They don't come wearing clearly marked uniforms or in airplanes. They don't necessarily launch from overseas, certainly not directly. So the question is, what is the radar of the 21st century? And the answer is the radar is information. It's the ability to get early warning about people whose identities you may not know. It's about the ability to fuse and analyze that information in real time so that you can react in a way that effectively prevents an attack. And it's the ability to operationalize that, to take that information and turn it into something that actually can yield protection. And this is really very much the challenge of security in the 21st century. Now, if you look at the world we live in now and the world we thought we lived in at the end of the 20th century, there's a huge change in the way the landscape appears. In the 20th century, if you'd asked most people, the world, in terms of threats, was divided neatly into two categories. In some ways, it was a digital world. It was binary. There was war fighting, which was dealt with by the military, almost always overseas, had a distinctive set of rules and doctrines that apply when you're fighting a war. And on the other side was law enforcement. You have criminals, you deal with them in the law enforcement mode. You have a criminal justice system which operates in a particular way, and you have another set of doctrines. And the two are really quite different. At least we thought they were quite different. And we built two different security architectures. And the challenge was to take each threat and each particular group or person we were worried about and figure out which of the two buckets it belonged in and then to operate accordingly. The problem is the enemy actually did not agree with those categories. And I like to say we've moved from a world of digital security where it's either 1 or 0, either war or crime, into a world of quantum security. If you know what quantum theory is, and you probably know better than I do, but the gist of it is that you can have an entity or a particle in an infinite number of places at any given point in time. It's not a one or the other, it's in every place. And that's in many ways the way threats are these days. something can be simultaneously a criminal threat and a war threat and something that partakes of both or neither. And so we have to adapt ourselves in our way of thinking about how to deal with threats to this very, very new model of how threats may come at us. So what do we look at in the world in terms of where the dangers are? Well, we have three major aspects that have been the legacy of globalization. One is networking, the ability for people to create communities, both for good or ill, not by meeting in person or interacting face-to-face, but by using various networking tools. The second big area of change is technological leverage. The kind of damage a small group of people can do now is very, very much greater than would have been the case 50 or 100 years ago. Basically, a small group, and certainly a network of small groups, can cause the kind of damage today that would have previously been reserved to a powerful nation state. So again, to go back to that old theory that we divided war and criminality and we treated them as differently, what do you do when the criminals have the ability to do more damage than a nation state could have done 50 or 100 years ago? Well, you got to change your way of thinking about it. So that's the second great challenge, the technological leverage, both for good or ill, that globalization has given us. And the third issue, which kind of flows from the first two, is the problem of ungoverned space. What do you do when there are parts of the world where the sovereign government that has the nominal control over the territory either can't exercise that control or doesn't want to exercise that control? You see that in Afghanistan. You see that now in parts of Pakistan. You see it in Somalia. You see it in Yemen. And the problem with these areas of ungoverned space is they are breeding grounds for the kind of networking and experimentation with weapons that can be very devastating that create threats for everybody. It's no longer a local problem when a particular area or region is out of control. It is now a global problem because that is the launching pad for attacks such as the one we recently saw in Times Square, or the attempted detonation of a bomb on the airliner coming into Detroit, or the Madrid bombing, or 9/11 itself. So it's changed the game in terms of our ability to turn our backs on the world and in fact, the imperative now to really engage with the world, because if we don't engage with the world, it will engage with us. So what does that mean for people who are focused on security? Well, it means we've got to start to think about using this concept of information as part of the way we deal with these threats of a networked world with a great deal of technological leverage and these dangerous ungoverned spaces, which are areas that are platforms for misconduct and criminality and even terror. And information helps us because it helps us strike at the connections that allow the network to operate. Information is important because it teaches us, if not how to prevent, certainly how to detect some of the weapons that technology can give us, and perhaps, if not to detect it, at least to respond and to mitigate the damage. And technologies and information is important because it gives us visibility into what's going on into these ungoverned spaces, so we can start to address some of the problems that are being bred there. I'm not going to take you through all of this at great length, but I'll give you some ideas of some of the ways we've used information in building up fairly substantial defenses over the last 8 or 9 years. Take our border. We have hundreds of thousands of people who cross our border every single day. And in the course of a year, millions of people enter our airports, seaports, cross our land ports of entry, and of course there are others who come between the ports of entry. Most of those people, the vast majority, come for benign reasons. Some of them come to do bad things. How do we figure out who they are? Well, you know, in the old days we relied on passports. And the idea was we had what I call an identity-based way of dealing with security. If we knew you were a bad guy and we were able to detect your identity when you came across the border, we could keep you out. And that's, you know, useful as far as it goes, but here's the problem. How do you deal with people with phony identities or counterfeit identities? How do you deal with people who are dangerous but you don't know their names? You may know characteristics about their behavior, but you don't actually, you've never identified them or encountered them. And so we moved to a much broader system of using information. The first thing we did is we changed our attitude to documents, and we built a process for creating secure documents. The idea being that if you presented a passport secured by a chip with a biometric, we would have a high degree of confidence that you were who you said you were. Now, that doesn't solve all the problem. It solves the problem of the known terrorist. But at least it does solve that problem. How do you deal with the unknown terrorist? Well, one way to deal with it is to look at connections or to integrate data or information about people's behavior. And to that end, we reached an arrangement with the airlines. Actually, we made them do it. It wasn't like it was an agreement. We had the legal authority to have them turn over to us commercial data about people who are flying into the United States. Very basic stuff, not highly private. What's your phone number, email contact, how'd you pay for the ticket, who you're traveling with, things of that sort. It turns out this kind of information is terribly useful if you can integrate it and connect it up, because it shows that people who on their face might not have any nefarious characteristic actually are connected up to some very dangerous people. A couple of years ago, we ran this type of information using commercial data that we had extracted about the 19 hijackers on 9/11. And we were able to demonstrate that using the kinds of techniques we use now to collect and integrate this information, we could have identified 15 of the 19 hijackers and showed they were connected to each other. So this is a very powerful tool for identifying the unknown terrorist or organized criminal who is a threat to the country. And the last element of this is the biometric, fingerprints. Before 9/11, there was a rudimentary program to collect fingerprints from non-Americans who came in the U.S. as a way of better comparing their passports against records we had in our existing files, so as to spot whether someone was coming in using someone else's passport. But in the last several years, we moved to a 10 fingerprint system where we take 10 fingerprints from everybody who's a non-American who comes into the U.S., and we compare it not only against our existing files, but against latent prints, which are trace fingerprints that are extracted from battlefields or safe houses or training camps all over the world. And our military forces and the FBI go out when they examine a training camp or a safe house, and they take fingerprints. Those fingerprints go into a database. What this enables us to do is to detect people whose names we don't know, whose biographies we don't know, but whose fingerprints have turned up in a training camp or on a battlefield or in a safe house. And this has turned out to be very useful too. So this is a great example of how information has now become the radar of the 21st century. And it has given us the capability to spot threats coming in the same way that radar used to be able to spot missiles or aircraft. The second challenge here is, how do you operationalize this information? Now, this is a small company. I think Chitra told me you've got about 280 people. And I thought it might be interesting to hear what it was like to integrate and grow a department of 218,000 people with a $50 billion budget, which is what the Department of Homeland Security was at the day I left on January 20th, 2009. And the answer is it's very challenging, but there's a great lesson in how you motivate and fuse and operationalize information, which is how you make use of it. And again, remember, the department was born at a time that people were still trying to figure out what the right strategy was for dealing with terrorism, and also with real concerns about what might come next. And the challenge was to take all of the agencies, or most of the agencies, that had responsibilities for protecting our border, air, sea, and land, our infrastructure, our airports, our transit systems, and to find a way to integrate it and fuse it and create a organization that could operationalize and carry out missions based on intelligence. And the great lesson for me and the benefit for me in getting to work with my colleagues in this organization was to adapt what the military has long done, which is the deliberate planning process, and to take it into the civilian domain. And that's a huge challenge, because unlike a military organization, which is very hierarchical and operates based on command and control, in a civilian organization, people are not used to taking orders. I mean, there is a certain amount of internal discipline, but there's a lot more independence and a lot more initiative that's undertaken, particularly in some departments. So the question is, how do you turn that into a jointly operating and effective unified organization? Well, the lesson we learned and we tried to put into effect has to do with this issue of planning. And what planning is about, at least as I experienced it at DHS, was looking at not the job that people are doing, but the objective they're trying to achieve. And to recognize that, and to bring people into the process of selecting and adopting and identifying with the mission in a way that would incentivize them to view success not as I've completed my job, but as we have completed the mission. We have succeeded in doing what we're going to do. And I'll tell you how I came to that approach. When I was a prosecutor, we used to put cases together. We'd investigate, as a big organized crime case, like the commission case. We'd deal with lots of different agents, the FBI lab, local police, DEA, and other police agencies. And everybody would have a specific task, but often when the task was done, the agents moved off to do something else and they kind of left it. And my belief was, when you're doing a very, very complicated case, it's not enough to have people do a job and leave it. They've got to be involved from start to finish. So what I started to do was I'd bring the agents in, and I would start to talk with them about the way the case would be presented at trial. And I would get their advice, and I would engage them in the process of thinking about, how are we going to get this evidence to a jury? How are we going to persuade the jury? What arguments are going to work? And how are we going to get this enterprise through completion of the trial until we can convict people? And through the process of working together in planning how to get this done, the agents I worked with got very excited by the idea that what they were doing was not just their job, but they were actually completing the task of convicting and sending to jail some very bad people. And they also came to understand that their job was a complete waste of time if we didn't wind up with a result at the end of the day. If the defendant walked out because we didn't get our act together, that was a complete waste of the agent's time. And that taught me a lot about what it is to get people to be motivated about the mission rather than the job. It has to do with having everybody take ownership of the outcome, being invested in the outcome, caring about the outcome, and then recognizing the way you get to the outcome is by everybody working together, not necessarily based only on what your task is, but based on what everybody needs to do to make sure you can get over the goal line. And that was very much the philosophy we took it at DHS. So, for example, when we looked at the border, when I came in 2005, we had an ever-increasing number of people who crossed the border between the ports of entry illegally. And part of the problem was this. People would cross the border, they'd be apprehended by Border Patrol agents maybe 10 or 20 miles inside the border. They'd be taken to a central facility, they'd be processed, photographed, and fingerprinted. And if they were Mexicans, it was pretty easy to drive them back across the border and put them back in Mexico. But if they weren't Mexicans, you had to arrange to send them back to their home country. And the problem is, the people who were responsible for having the detention beds were not linked up with the Border Patrol agents. So the number of beds that were available to detain people until they were sent back was a very much smaller number than the number of people being detained. And the consequence was people were arrested, booked, processed, and released and told to come back when the time to deport arrived. And that was about a 10% compliance rate. And that was called catch and release. So this is a bad situation, because the Border Patrol is irritated because they're doing all this work. It's hot, it's dangerous, and at the end of the day, the people are walking free. The people running the detention process feel stupid because they're not doing their job. And one of the fascinating things about dealing with criminal organizations like smuggling organizations is they rapidly learn how the law enforcement system works and exploits it, and they exploit it. So what they do is they start to tell people who are Mexican, pretend not to be a Mexican. Pretend to be a Costa Rican or someone from Guatemala, and then you'll get released. And by the way, it got so sophisticated that there was a special rule for people from El Salvador where El Salvadorians could not be kept for more than a certain amount of time. And as a consequence, the word quickly got out: when you're caught, pretend you're from El Salvador. So what did we do? We got everybody together in a big room, and we looked at the system, and we said, you know, you guys in the Border Patrol are wasting your time if we don't fix the detention issue. And we put our heads together, and we figured out a way to shorten the amount of time that it took to deport people, and also to find additional beds that we could shift money over to so we could wind up holding people until they were deported. And what's quite remarkable about this story is, within a very short period of time, we ended catch and release. And other than a few exceptional circumstances, people, when they were caught, were held until they were sent back again. And that changed the dynamic of people from Mexico claiming to be from Costa Rica and Guatemala, because the word got back very quickly that that's not going to help you. You're just going to spend more time sitting in a detention camp in the Arizona desert as opposed to going back to Mexico. So it was a great lesson in two things for me. How do you integrate and bind people to the mission? And how do you deal with incentivizing or disincentivizing criminal organizations? Okay, last thing, which is probably of greatest interest to you, is cybersecurity. In summer of 2007, Mike McConnell, who was the Director of National Intelligence, and Keith Alexander, who is the Director of the National Security Agency, came to me. And over a period of weeks, they schooled me in some of what goes on in the world of cyber attack and defense, all of which is heavily classified, which I'm not going to talk about. But the outgrowth of that was to convince me that the one great area of national security that we had not done enough about was cybersecurity. And as you probably know, and it's been made public, there are hundreds of thousands of attacks on our networks every single day. So this is a real problem. It's not a theoretical problem. Out of this was born the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, which we launched in January 2008, which has been adopted and carried forward by the current administration. But is still at a relatively immature stage of development. This is in many ways the biggest challenge this country faces, and I think you all know that, those of you who work in this firm, because you're involved in dealing with this on a regular basis. First of all, we are faced with enormous theft of American intellectual property. If you just look at what's reported openly, going back to the attack in January against Google and a number of other entities, and all kinds of other open source described attacks, we are losing terabytes of intellectual property to other parts of the world. Some of it to criminals, frankly, some of it to other countries. That's a huge issue, but that's not the worst of what we could face. In Estonia in 2007, there was a serious denial of service attack on government agencies. And in 2008, when the Russians invaded Georgia, that invasion was accompanied by a cyber attack that was designed to degrade the communications and command and control structures within Georgia. What this tells us is, and we know this again from open source material, that there are nation states which either tacitly or explicitly have adopted information warfare as an element of their national security strategy. They recognize that degrading command and control systems can be as effective as dropping powerful bombs in incapacitating an enemy. And certainly everybody who saw the phenomenal war-fighting capability the United States demonstrated in the first stage of the war in Iraq recognized that the key to our success in that early couple of weeks was our highly effective command and control and information systems. So that if you fight on information warfare, you're striking at the vital undercurrent of our defense. But it's also true for all of our critical infrastructure. Our financial system, our electric grid, our FAA system for organizing air traffic control. If someone were to embed in our systems things that would degrade or destroy our capability to operate. It would have a huge economic and quite possibly actually an impact on life and safety for a substantial period of time. The third threat I like to describe as corruption of service. Supposing someone didn't deny service, supposing what they did was insert either hardware or software or remotely attack a network in a way that over a substantial period of time subtly altered data in the system. Maybe it would add and subtract a penny every day from everybody's bank account. Maybe it would do that on an exponential basis. Well, you might not notice that the first week or the second week, but at some point people would have a crisis of confidence in the system. And if you want to have some glimpse of what that's like, look back to 2008 when there was a period of time people wondered about the safety of banks, and people started to worry if they had to withdraw money from their savings account. Well, imagine if all the online transactions became suspect. That would cause a huge amount of damage to the United States and the global economy. So this is a very, very big issue. And here's where that networking and that technological leverage come together to create a particularly challenging scenario. We have to deal not only with countries that might do this, we have to deal with networks that might do this, whether they're terrorists or criminals seeking to extort money, or just people who want to make mischief, or anarchists. And the ability to have sophisticated and shrewd people develop a capability to attack our networks is something that now becomes a problem for everybody, not just the government, but for all the private people who operate networks. So we've got a lot of work to do. Some of it is technical, and frankly, that's the least of our problems. A lot more of it is strategic. We have to answer questions like, who owns the ultimate responsibility to protect the network? Is it each individual private entity? Is it the government? Do we want the government to sit on the network? Or do we merely want the government to enable somebody else to protect the network? How do we deal with supply chain security? How do we know that the hardware, the software we put into our systems, which comes from all over the world, doesn't have embedded within it something that could potentially be triggered either to exfiltrate information or to corrupt or damage our systems? And do we have the wherewithal, and do we want to undertake the expense of verifying and assuring ourselves with respect to the hardware and the code? How do we deal with insider threats? You know, a question I like to ask audiences when I speak about this issue is, if you've ever gone to a big convention or conference, you know, they give you like a goodie bag. Usually has some stuff in it. And sometimes they give you like a thumb drive. What do you do with it? Well, I throw mine out. But I'm going to tell you, there's a lot of people who go, wow, it's free, and they stick it in their computer. They don't know what they're putting in their computer. So you've got to even get down to the level of educating people in a workforce about what someone called cyber hygiene. How do you protect the hygiene of your network, just with respect to infection brought from within, unwittingly or wittingly? So these are huge challenges. There's a lot of thought to be given to this, including what our national response should be when we're attacked. Should we respond by retaliating? Is there a way deterrence works in this world? How do we attribute the attack? How do we prove the attribution? Is our response limited to the world of cyber, or is our response also to include physical responses? You know, can we bomb a server as a way of taking it out instead of simply trying to disable it over the network? So these are really critical issues. In the end, solving these problems is going to require sitting down and making some hard policy choices about our architecture and our strategy. But the ability to do that is going to depend again on information. Our understanding of what the threats are, our understanding of what our own capabilities are, and our understanding of what technology may hold. So it's a hard set of problems. The exciting and good news for most of the people in this room is it's a set of problems that you will probably get to work on and will find challenging and exciting and maybe quite possibly lucrative as well. Anyway, that's my tour of security in the 21st century, and I'm happy to take questions.
So the way that we do the Q&A here is you raise your hand, and then I will bring the microphone to you. So don't start talking until you have the microphone, because we do have this on on recording. So.
Hi, Terry Sentner, Booz Allen Hamilton. I know a lot of the information sharing problems that we have come from what we call stovepipes or silos, some of which are culture induced. I know that even in DHS there are still agencies within that one big thing that don't share just because they never used to. But we also have many that are legally induced by Congress, like between the military and the civil authorities. Do you see any of those being broken down by Congress, or are we going to have to continue to deal with those?
You know, I think when we did the Patriot Act, I think most of the legal barriers were broken down. Not all of them, but most of them. I think probably at this point in the U.S., the issues are more cultural than they are legal. And some of it, frankly, is people don't understand that what they have is valuable. You know, they assume intelligence is something that comes from a spy or a satellite. They don't know that sometimes, you know, very kind of basic public information they collect is intelligence. Where you will see a problem is overseas. The Europeans have a very different view of information. They actually believe it ought to be stovepiped, and they believe that you should not share information. I suspect that belief will evaporate when if a few bombs go off. But that's a serious obstacle, because we have a problem with the Europeans not wanting to share information because they have a very different model. In fairness, I should say, that comes out of an obvious historical experience with communism and fascism that we don't have, that is still a very big legacy. But the consequence is they do have a very serious set of legal obstacles.
I had a question about the DNI, and given some of the similarities between DHS and DNI and in their inception and some of their mandates, how do you see, and this is your personal opinion, the DNI, both the actual director and then the agency, succeeding?
Well, first of all, we had one big advantage at DHS that the DNI doesn't have, which is the Secretary of DHS, however broad the department was, had authority over the entire department. So if I were a secretary, I had the ability to say, do this, and it got done. The DNI is not quite in that position. It's a hybrid. It has a certain amount of coordinating authority. It has a certain amount of authority to deal with budget and personnel, but it doesn't have day-to-day operational authority. That makes it a hard job. And I think the success of the DNI depends largely on the president and what the president wants his DNI to do and how he wants the DNI to interact with the heads of the other intelligence components. If the president wants the DNI to be the strategic guide, the person who looks at the strategy and talks about how to allocate things, but is not the tactical commander, then the DNI gets a space to do what the DNI wants to do, and the heads of the agencies run what they're supposed to do, which is run the agencies. If the president wants the DNI to actually be really the commander of the agencies, then the president has to tell everybody else, this is my person, this is the person who's I'm going to be looking to, and you report to them and do what he wants or she wants, or you're going to answer to me. I mean, in effect, you have to do that. I'm not, you can argue wiring diagrams till the cows come home, and every time there's been a problem in the U.S. government in the years I've been involved in government, the first reaction is, let's reorganize. The truth is, every organization has its pluses and its minuses. You can argue, both ways. There comes a time when whatever it is, you've got to make it work. And to make it work, you've got to preserve it with consistency over a period of time so people get accustomed to it. And the people in the jobs have to be committed to making the jobs work, and the president has to be behind them and make that very clear. If you do that, almost any system will work. But if someone once said, you don't grow a tree by tearing it up at the roots every year. If you want to grow the tree, you got to let the roots take hold, and you got to let the people actually carry out the missions. So I think it's a tough job, but frankly, if the president wants the DNI to succeed, the DNI will succeed. Yeah.
Sir, you've spoken about information warfare and warning signals. I know Palantir is very serious about civil liberties and protecting personal rights. How do you see the way that we can provide warning signals evolving, with lone operatives being the key way that many of these groups will attack these days?
Well, that's a great question. And I think there are two answers I'd give. One is I think often there's a trade-off seen between security and liberty and privacy, which I actually think is a false trade-off. I think in many cases, security and privacy are actually part of the same thing. I tend to look at privacy as your right to make sure that the people you give information to voluntarily don't violate the trust. Security is making sure that some third party doesn't come in and steal that information and use it themselves. So I think if you unpack some of the issues that are sometimes seen as a contradiction, many of the steps you put into security actually are consistent with civil liberties. But sometimes there are trade-offs, and an interesting challenge is how do you architect the system so as to balance those trade-offs. And I'll give you a great example from the analog world. Remember when caller ID first came up? So people, had a system on where if you called, your number appeared on the caller ID. And then somebody said, wait a second, that violates my right to be anonymous. Supposing I don't want my identity disclosed, and there could be reasons why you don't want to do that. Let's say you're calling in a tip to the police station. So people said, okay, you should have the right to mask the identification on the caller ID. Now, you would think that creates a tension. Whose right is going to prevail? The right of the recipient of the call to know who's calling, or the right of the caller to preserve his or her anonymity? But if you think about the architecture of that system, it's actually a great balance, because the recipient of the call may not have the right to know the identity of the caller, but the recipient definitely has the right to say, no, I won't take the call, and gets to make the choice about whether they will tolerate the anonymization or not. The caller gets to preserve the anonymization, although the caller has to then accept the risk that the recipient won't take the call. That's, to me, a simple but actually pretty good illustration of how you can balance security and liberty. You need to find ways to architect a system that gives everybody who participates an opportunity to decide the level of openness they want, but to recognize that there may be a trade-off in terms of the counterparty. So you may not be willing to accept a transaction with somebody who holds certain information back. I think what that will eventually do is create a system of systems within the internet, where for certain kinds of transactions or activities, and we already basically have this because we have classified systems, you'll have to give up quite a bit of information and maybe jump through quite a few hoops to engage at a certain level where you're dealing with very serious and valuable things. But maybe at other levels of transaction, you won't be required to do that, and people will be happy to operate at a lower level of security. The other issue, which I love to talk about, is we spend a lot of time agitated about our Social Security numbers. Someone's going to get our Social Security number. To me, the Social Security number is the stupidest form of identification that you can come up with, because it's a variation of what I call secret information. I have a password or something secret, and that's my key to get in. The problem is, in order to make that work, I've got to give you the password. And the more people who have the password or the Social Security number, the easier it is to lose it, and therefore, the more widespread it is as an identifier, the more vulnerable it becomes. That's why biometrics, tokens, multi-factor authentication, creative ways to architect multiple systems are a much more effective way of dealing with things, particularly to do it in a way that doesn't make the very system of security itself carry the seeds of its own vulnerability within it. So a great, hugely interesting analytic challenge for people in your area is, how do you architect systems that can simultaneously protect security and privacy for everybody who wants to participate in the system? Yeah.
I was interested in your point about post 9/11, or when you called and wanted to know what was said to the husband of the woman who's on the plane and thinking about where valuable information comes from. And I was part of an effort with the Department of Defense to recently, during the Haiti crisis, to tap into knowledge on the ground from NGOs or people or citizens in Haiti, and interest where information might not necessarily come through traditional sources. They tend to be valuable. And one of the efforts there is to, deploy smartphones or other types of technologies that can kind of create a citizen sensor of types that can be transmit information through non-traditional avenues. And I was wondering if you saw a value potentially this citizen sensor model in being applied to the Homeland Security
challenges. That's a huge value. We began in the last couple of years to work with the people at Facebook and Twitter about using that as a way of dealing with people in disasters, as a way of getting data from people on the ground from a variety of different avenues. But I'd say even as interesting as that is the use of indirect information. For example, there are people who believe that if you look at, and this might have civil liberties issues, but if you looked at, for example, the number of people in a particular area who are searching on a search engine with the word flu, that would give you early warning of a possible flu epidemic, because it's a way of detecting that a large number of people in a particular area are experiencing symptoms that are causing them to want to get on the internet and ask about flu. So, for example, there's a great public health capability if you could anonymize the data of people searching for things about various kinds of medical issues, and then analyze it in the aggregate to see changes in patterns that might tell you that people are beginning to feel ill or there's some kind of a public health issue going on. And there might be other applications for that. The challenge to the earlier point is that invading people's civil liberty? If you anonymize it and you aggregate it, has it become sufficiently removed from the individual so that it's not a privacy issue? And how do you balance that against the positive benefit? But that's what's fascinating about information. The value of the information and the threat that the information poses in terms of privacy is largely a function of how you architect the system for collection and analysis. And if you drill down and you ask yourself, well, what do we mean by privacy? What are we really concerned about? You can come up with very creative ways to package information so that you can get a lot of the benefit that you want to get out of it without necessarily creating a privacy issue. But it's a peculiar combination of mathematics and analytics on the one hand and human psychology and sociology on the other, because it requires you to understand how people feel about stuff. And that to me is that blend between hard analytics and kind of social psychology is really a kind of the intersection that a lot of this work is going to be done at now. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess extending on that question for a moment, if you buy into the concept of citizen sensors, what about collaborative security models that allow, U.S. citizens to actually participate more actively in the analysis and distribution of the data, rather than just being essentially recipients on lists or sensors to funnel data to you?
That's an interesting question, and there I have to say I'm a little more hesitant. The challenge is this, and I know there's a belief in some areas that, kind of wiki is the wisdom of crowds. The problem is the wisdom of crowds may work in the aggregate. It doesn't often work in the particular. And this is where you actually hit a different kind of civil liberties challenge. If you were to engage a lot of people in analyzing things on something that has a high emotional content like terrorism, you might very well find that people who are most interested in engaging are those with very strong feelings on one or another side of the issue. And I'm not sure that averaging that out or kind of taking the aggregate view would give you anything more than an average of extreme views. So I'm personally cautious about that. I do think, though, that there, in a way we already do that. We have systems in place where people in a community, if they have good relations with the local authorities, the police, whatever it is, it's when you see something, say something. It's the vendor. in Times Square who told a mounted policeman there's something funny in that car. It's the clerk in a photographic store, developing store in South Jersey that saw something funny on some photographs of Fort Dix that led to a case being brought against people who wanted to attack Fort Dix. So in a way we do that by encouraging individuals to speak up and talk to the authorities. The question is there a way to use the internet to aggregate that information that would actually be more useful than detrimental? And there I have to say the jury is out in my mind on that. The thing about the public health stuff is because it's indirect, it's pretty accurate. In other words, people are searching flu. They don't have a political point to make. They just have a cough or a sneeze and they want to see if they have the flu. If you explicitly put things on the internet and ask people to analyze it, I fear that what happens is you don't really get analysis as much as you get emotional reaction, and I'm not sure that's terribly helpful. Yeah.
I guess though, so I think when we talk about things like collaborative security solutions, it's natural to jump right to the Wikipedia kind of model, but I guess I think in the minds of a number of folks in the security community, you know, with the success of things like Web 2.0 and more recently the kind of hype around Gov 2.0, the idea is that at a broad level you've got United States citizens who care deeply about this and want to go a bit beyond just being a sensor where information goes in and they don't really see whatever comes out or it's not necessarily meaningful to them. And then this idea that there are, by conservative estimates, 2.7 million people in the US that have security clearance of one form or another. So at a minimum, having 2.7 million people who are participating in the analysis, correlation, and architecture of a cyber defense seems like there might be some potential.
Yeah, so if you're asking if you then refined it, if you didn't make it the whole country, but you created a subset of people who were had a certain amount of knowledge and interest and maybe were not necessarily at the fringes, you know, then the utility grows. I'm not against it, but I think you have to be careful about making sure that you don't wind up with a lot of rabbit holes and not a lot of rabbits. So, but I think this, I mean, the intelligence community has done similar things in encouraging people in the community to work together on analyzing things. And there, of course, the balance changes because you have people who are trained, they've been vetted so they're not, you know, loopy. And, you know, there you can argue that harnessing the collective knowledge exceeds the you know, whatever the downside is of wasted, you know, blind alleys.
Sir, looking at this idea of trends, every year we spend billions of dollars trying to be safer, and I feel less safe every year. And we're spending more money, putting more effort, and either because of the media, because somebody wants their 15 minutes of fame, or because all these individual terrorists, what can we do so that my kids that are 5 and 9 can feel safe? Because every year it gets worse, and they're going to be afraid to go out of the house.
Well, you shouldn't feel, I mean, I gotta say, if you feel less safe, I have to say, I can't, it's always hard to prove what would be the case if these measures weren't in place, but you'd have to say that we're certainly safer than we were.
I would say that protection against the spectacular, well, you know, we're doing a good job
right.
in that. But just
but there's another piece of this, which is resilience. Yep. And that's being able to understand. I mean, here's my view of the way we really need to look at this problem. There's a level of attack above which we would have a very serious problem. A large-scale loss of life, significant persistent economic impact, or worse. And that's the stuff we really have to focus our energies on stopping. And the good news is it usually requires a critical mass of people and capability such that we have a higher likelihood of detecting it. At the other end of the scale is as bad as it was, Major Hassan. One guy picks up a gun and kills 11 people and wounds 32 people. That's bad. We have some hope of stopping that, but by no means are we likely to bat 100%. But you know something? We've lived with that since the beginning of the Republic, and we've survived it. And we survived Columbine, we survived Virginia Tech. So that's in the realm of things which are bad, but they're not game changers. And to me, the right answer is this. We've got to be resilient enough to accept the kind of basic risk of life. Crazy people, whether motivated by ideology or just nuttiness, who are going to do some bad stuff. It's going to be bad for the victims, but it's not going to affect the country. On the other side, there are things that could be done to the country at a scale of which would be really earth-shattering. When you start to get into biological weapons, you know, a serious anthrax attack, not the one we had where the perpetrator deliberately, apparently, was forbearing, didn't do what he could have done. But I mean, a real persistent, repetitive attack or a major cyber attack. Now you're talking about a consequence that would be a horrific consequence. And there, I think, is where the investment ought to be. So it's somewhere between a balance of a realistic understanding of the risk and an acceptance that there will be some risk, but to try to keep it below a certain level, and a very, very persistent dedication to pushing down the high risks. Maybe lower probability, but certainly higher consequence. That, to me, is how you feel safe. And look, if you look at the bad stuff that's happened, you know, we had H1N1. That wasn't man-made. It could have been worse, but certainly it was a harbinger of what you could get. You know, you've had natural disasters. There's a lot of stuff that can happen just because of Mother Nature, and we live with that. So a lot of it is getting the population kind of focused, getting their heads in the right place about what is realistic risk management. And that's really the piece I would end on. I would say that what this is always about is not risk elimination. There is no risk elimination. It is risk management. It is pushing down the risk, particularly of the really, really catastrophic event, to the point that the risks you're dealing with are manageable, either because the scale is manageable or because our capability of responding will mitigate it to the point of being manageable. If that's where we wind up, and I think we're pretty much in that space now, but we've got to keep working to make sure we don't fall out of that space, then I think that's what human life is about. I think that's a reasonable place to be on planet Earth.
Quick follow-up?
Yeah.
So what I think is missing, what it seems to me is missing is the strength of the communities that we live in. You know, I come home from work, everybody drives in their garage and you don't see anybody. And they're taking their kids to soccer instead of playing around the house. So is the government, I mean, it seems to me that that's what's missing. I don't know how to do that. I mean, but if people were tightly connected with their neighborhoods and communities, then there wouldn't be this surprise kook attack, you know, that nobody saw coming, because that never happened before, because everybody was much closer related. So I don't know what the answer is, but, sorry?
Yeah, you know, some communities are, I mean, yeah, I think different parts of the country are different, and there's some places where there are strong communities and people do speak up. I thought one of the big areas where I argued that we ought to do this, it didn't get a very positive reaction, was we ought to educate people into preparedness. That one of the big challenges people have when they deal with a catastrophe is they just don't know what the heck to do. They don't know how to they don't have any kind of plan, they don't have any stuff, water, food, battery, whatever. And it's not that hard to assemble that stuff, but if you've never been trained to do that or to think about that, it may seem impossible. And you know, if you go to Switzerland or Israel, where people serve in the military, you know, they kind of develop a capability because they've been trained in how to plan and how to do certain things, so that if something happens, they can pick up and they know how to kind of prepare themselves. I would love to see our schools build as part of, you know, the same way that they teach our kids to force your parents to recycle, nag your parents to death if they don't recycle, or they teach the kids about preventing fires. If they taught the kids basic preparedness, and go home and have your parents show you what the plan is and where's the water and where's the food. But when we floated this idea, it got a really negative reaction from some people who said you're fear-mongering. But you know, the truth of the matter is that's how you really drive social changes. You get the kids, and you educate them, and you demystify it. And then once it becomes accessible, it's much easier to get people to actually carry out.
Actually, we're going to wrap up on that. It's 8:10. So.
Right, yeah, you have socializing.
Yes, exactly. And you'll be around for a couple of minutes, I guess, if people want to come up. I think I heard there at the end that he wants us all to serve 2 years in the military.
No, I didn't say that. But I'd like you to, hey, very simple. You know, just figure out what your plan is. Get your water, your food, your batteries, your medicine, your, crank radio. Make sure you have your car is generally gassed up. I mean, have some cash around the house. Know where you'd go if there was a problem. It's not really that hard, and even those who got stuck during the snowstorm this last winter probably got a little bit of a taste of it mattered a lot whether you were prepared or not prepared. And you don't need to be in the military for that, but you just need to be able to think about it. And there are websites, ready.gov. It helps you with that.
Great, thank you.